Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Mary and today I'm going to be doing a series of movie studies in gouache. So these are all sped up. You can see I'm doing the quick underpaintings here. These are just washes to set the tone for the piece. Underpaintings are a really good way to basically make sure the page that you're working on is no longer white. So when you don't cover the whole thing, you get instead the color that you laid down as the underpainting rather than white. I find that this helps a piece look more opaque and more finished, but it also lends sort of an overarching color story to the piece. So as you can see, I did different colors of underpaintings for each of these different studies. And I did those first just to give them time to dry. So why might you want to do movie studies for your art practice? One reason is that cinematography is really great for composition and for learning about values, framing, and narrative, especially some of the really well done films. So if you think about films that are critically acclaimed or they've won awards for cinematography or something like that, usually you can be pretty sure that those films are going to teach you some pretty cool things about composition in illustration. There's another sort of study that you can do where you draw every shot and every change in angle and every pan from a film, and they often recommend that you do this with Steven Spielberg films. He's a master filmmaker, and the way he composes his shots and his cinematographers compose their shots is really smart. It's really intelligent. So, by doing movie studies, what you're doing is learning from people who know more than you, basically, and have perfected, in a way, the art of showing mood, expression, and narrative through composition because you're doing stills instead of, recreating a film with motion. So I started with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade because I knew definitely that there were scenes that I wanted to paint. And this one in particular, when the temple is sort of crashing down and the knight waves farewell to Indiana Jones and his dad as they leave, has a really nice atmosphere to it with the lighting passing through the cobwebs and everything sort of wreathed in dust and smoke from the destruction of the set for the film. And so I was able to know right off the bat that there's a lot of cool light. A lot of it is painted in Payne's gray to keep it a blue, dusty color, and using absolutely no black so that it doesn't reach fully down to the darkest dark of the spectrum, because the actual screenshot doesn't reach that dark. It actually stays sort of a 90 or 80% gray at the darkest. So, with all that in mind, working on this piece became an exercise in differentiating between warm and cool grays with a little bit of pink for the man's face. When I was selecting the screenshots that I wanted to paint for this video, I made sure to make them all very different. So I made sure I had two sort of cool tone paintings and two roughly warm tone paintings, different keys, different focuses. And the focus for the screenshot from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was just painting a nice portrait with interesting lighting. I love Cate Blanchett. I think she's beautiful. Her doing a Russian accent for this film is also kind of very entertaining. I started out by blocking in the opaque darks surrounding the portrait, and then for the face I actually worked mostly transparently. You can use gouache to paint portraits opaquely. I just chose not to in this particular instance, mostly because I've been working more in watercolor recently, and to get skin tones and the sort of layering of darks and lights that I needed for this reference image, where the light sort of fades from the top left of her face and drops off. It sort of gets very subtly darker. I just worked transparently because that made my life a little bit easier. to get some of those subtle transitions. What I'm using for her face is very, very primary, basically. It's all a mixture of yellows, yellow ochre, a warm and a cool red, and I'm even using some cerulean blue in some areas to tone back the face and make certain areas recede. And I'm also painting in a mixture of artificial and natural light, which you can see, especially when the video is sped up like this, that the sun was sort of doing its own thing, going behind clouds, coming back out. And so it's easier for your mind to adjust the warm and cool in your painting in person. And as you can see here, I actually got a big beam of light that crossed over my page. So I just covered that with my hand so that I could keep everything in the same amount of light, so I knew what my values were and what my value relationships were. And I just did a ton of glazing on her face, basically. A lot of it going back in, fixing things up. And at the very, very last, I added a few opaque highlights to the portrait. Now, moving from a portrait completed very transparently, now for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, I'm going to be working on a portrait that I did very, very opaquely instead. Naturally, because this scene in the film is so red, I included some red in the underpainting, as well as some yellow because it's actually a very complex lighting scheme for this scene. There's the red coming from the fire, but there's also a cool light from the left and sort of a more neutral light from the right. It's very complicated, and if you look at the screenshot that I took for this, your mind initially wants to say, yeah, it's all red. But by doing studies, you can find the subtleties and the differences in lighting schemes that you wouldn't necessarily notice at first. And maybe you wouldn't think to include 3 whole light sources in your illustrations, but it actually is a really useful tool to help establish contrast. And basically, what I mean by that is having different lighting sources. For example, the cool light that will show up on the left side of Molaram, the character, it helps pop him out from the background because there isn't cool light really anywhere else. So it basically, in the real world, gives him an outline. It's not a full outline, and it's still very naturalistic, but that's just one of the tools that use a lot in film to create legible images. You always want your character to stand out from the background, unless the point is that they're fading into the background. Maybe they're sneaky or a spy or they're hiding. But especially for this scene, it's a big evil antagonist and he's holding a human heart and it's very grotesque. You want him to stand out. So he's lit so dramatically with all this red. And I'm using mostly cadmium red light for this, and it's actually a very opaque color. I mean, gouache is opaque to begin with, but the red sort of dictates where this painting goes and just ends up being like a big, blocky, chunky, juicy study. Really just finding the little differences in tone of the red to help make it a little more realistic. For example, you can see I'm sort of lighting him with more of a peachy tone on his hand and his face, and there's actually some purple in the human heart that he's holding just from the shadows and the lighting combined. So this is what you get when you really stare at an image for a long time. You can pick apart all these differences and then remember them for when you're doing your own illustrations in the future. Now, moving on to the last painting, which is actually of the first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I wanted to focus more on the environment and on the lighting. So I selected a scene where the main character isn't really Indiana Jones at this point. The main character of this sequence is the light, because it is casting this beautiful glow on the wall with hieroglyphics. It's lighting up the scepter, and it eventually shows the way to the Ark of the Covenant on the little miniature map of Tanis in front of him. So it's sort of a difficult thing to paint light like this, and it takes a long time. This study that I worked on, I only spent about half an hour doing it. And if I were to do it again, I would spend a long, long time working on it and be very patient with my glazes and layers of opacity, because the most convincing way to paint light is always to do it in a way where light passes through your painting, which is definitely more obvious in oil paintings, and even in watercolor paintings to a certain extent. Gouache is actually probably not the best medium to be painting a scene like this, but that's still a good way to learn. You take something that's more challenging, um, and a medium that maybe doesn't suit exactly what you're doing. But if you can find a solution that you still like, and you've learned something along the way, then it's totally worth it to spend the time doing it. I did a lot of glazing for this, a lot of washes, and basically teasing apart a scene that mostly looks like it's brown. Most of the scene looks very brown. But the way that it's filmed and the way that the harsh light coming through the opening in the ceiling interacts with the film camera, it actually splits up into this really bright ultramarine sort of blue and this very quinacridone pink color. So I made sure to include those in the lens flare that comes around the light. And I made sure to keep the brightest parts of the entire painting being the tip of the scepter and the center of the hole in the ceiling. So those are the whitest whites. Everything else is sort of a milkier color. And it's a very complex scene with hieroglyphics all over the walls. And because I'm painting so small, there's no point to painting every single little thing you can see in the scene. That's not the point of the study. Sometimes you have to know when to omit details in order to make a better painting. Because if I wanted to paint all the hieroglyphics, I probably could. But instead, I just wanted to suggest them and suggest the separations between the bricks. And overall, make a nicer, little, simpler, more gestural painting out of it. So that's basically all of it. Here are the finished scans of the paintings that I did for this. I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you like what you saw, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Bye!